The garage smelled like motor oil and burnt coffee, and Daniel Hayes had long since stopped noticing either. He had opened Hayes' auto at 7 that morning, the same way he opened it every morning with the roll-up door grinding on its tracks, a thermos of black coffee balanced on the corner of the workbench, and Lily still half asleep in the folding chair beside the window, her sneakers dangling 6 inches above the concrete floor. She was 6 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's habit of watching everything without saying anything. She kept a spiral notebook in her backpack where she drew pictures of engines she couldn't name but had already learned to recognize by sound. "The Peralta car's back," Lily said, not looking up from her notebook. She was sketching something with a green crayon. A bird, maybe. Or a wrench. It was always hard to tell. "I know." Daniel slid under the Civic on the creeper, reaching for a socket that wasn't quite where he'd left it. "Front right axle. I told Mr. Peralta in April. He didn't listen. People rarely do." She considered this with the gravity of someone 3 times her age. "Why?" Daniel rolled out from under the car. His forearms were dark with grease, and there was a smear of something along his jaw he hadn't noticed yet. He looked at his daughter, the way he always looked at his daughter, directly, fully, like she was the most serious person in the room. "Because listening takes longer than deciding," he said, "and most people are in a hurry." Lily wrote something in her notebook. He didn't ask what. He was 34 years old and had been running the garage alone for 3 years, ever since the divorce and the relocation and the quiet implosion of the life he'd built before this one. The before life was not something he discussed. He'd had a career, a real one, in a field that required absolute precision and a tolerance for long silences, but that career had ended, or rather, he had ended it, the way you end something when you realize the cost is too high, and the cost is your daughter growing up without a father who is actually present. He had no regrets. That was the honest truth, and he knew it was unusual. The neighborhood was the kind that didn't make the news unless something went wrong. Row houses with cracked driveways. A laundromat that was always busy. A Peruvian diner 3 blocks east that made excellent soup. Daniel knew his neighbors' cars better than their names, which was a professional advantage and a social limitation he'd made peace with. Lily went to Riverside Elementary. She had one close friend, a girl named Cassie, whose father ran the hardware store on the next block. They spent Saturdays building impractical things with scrap wood. The morning of the mall incident, which was not yet the mall incident, which was still just a Saturday, began the way most Saturdays began. Lily needed new sneakers. Daniel needed a replacement gasket. He couldn't source locally, and they had agreed to make a single trip out of both errands. Westfield Crossings was 20 minutes from the garage. It was the kind of mall that had once been ambitious and was now merely functional. A food court with 6 options, a movie theater, a sporting goods store, a handful of clothing chains doing their best. On weekends it filled with families and the ambient noise of a civilization organized around purchasing decisions. Daniel parked at the far end of the lot, near the loading docks, out of habit. He walked with Lily at his left side, her hand sometimes in his and sometimes swinging free. He was wearing a gray Henley he'd had for 4 years and work boots he'd had for 6. He was not the kind of man people looked at in a mall. He was background. He understood this and found it useful. They'd been inside for perhaps 20 minutes, Lily trying on shoes with the intensity of a structural engineer testing load-bearing capacity, when he heard the sound. He heard it before he consciously registered it, a child's cry. But not the cry of frustration or the cry of a scraped knee. A particular pitch, a particular rhythm, the cry of displacement of a small person who had reached for something familiar and found empty space. He looked up from the shoe rack. Lily looked up too. She was standing near the center of the main corridor, between a pretzel kiosk and a kiosk selling phone cases, and she was maybe 4 years old, with dark hair in 2 small braids and a yellow jacket that was slightly too large for her. She was crying the way small children cry when the fear has moved past the point of performance and become purely functional, a signal, pure and biological. "Help me, I am lost." Around her, People moved in the specific way that people in public spaces move around a crying child they've decided is not their responsibility. They slowed, they looked, they made faces of concern that did not translate into action. One woman with a stroller actually changed her path to go around the child rather than toward her. Daniel had seen this phenomenon studied academically and observed it practically in settings more dangerous than shopping malls. The bystander effect was not a moral failing so much as a social coordination problem. Everyone was waiting for someone else to be the designated responder. The longer the wait, the more normalized the inaction. He didn't wait. He covered the distance in a walk, not a run. Running scared children. He'd learned that in a professional context, and it remained true here. When he reached her, he did not stand over her. He lowered himself, one knee to the floor, the other bent, so that his eyes were level with hers. In a corridor full of adults who had been looking at her from above, from the height of people who had places to go and decisions to make, this was noticed by at least one observer, a 6-year-old girl in new sneakers who had followed her father without him asking. The crying child's name, he would learn this later, was Sophie. She was 4.5 and had been walking beside her nanny when a motorized display at a toy store window had briefly, completely, consumed her attention. By the time she looked away, the person she'd been beside was gone. "Hey," Daniel said. Just that. Not "stop crying," not "where's your mom," not "you're okay." Just, "Hey." Sophie looked at him. Her crying stuttered, dropped a register. "Your jacket has stars on the buttons," he said. "I can only see 3 from here." "How many are there?" This was not a technique he'd read in a parenting book. It was the same approach he'd used in the field when someone was in a heightened state and needed to be brought back to the immediate environment, give them something small and concrete and answerable. Not a question that required memory or history. A question that required only a look downward. At something right there. In the present, Sophie looked down at her buttons. Her breathing changed. The crying didn't stop, but it reorganized. Slowed. 4, she said. 4. I was close. He didn't move any closer. He stayed exactly where he was. "I'm Daniel. I'm going to stay right here with you while we find your person. Is that okay?" She didn't say yes, but she didn't move away. Lily stood 3 feet behind her father, watching. She had her notebook, and she was not drawing. Daniel had made 3 observations in the first 90 seconds. First, the child's shoes were wet on the right sole, not the left. There was a small splash fountain near the sporting goods entrance, the only water feature in this section of the mall. She'd come from that direction. Second, her hair had been recently combed. The braids still tight, no frizz at the temples. Whoever had done her hair that morning had done it carefully. This was not a child whose custodian was careless or inattentive. The separation was recent and was causing its custodian significant distress by now. Third, the yellow jacket was recognizable. Bright. A child, dressed in bright yellow by an attentive adult, was a child dressed to be visible, to be findable. The adult would come back to where they'd last seen her. The mistake most people made in this situation, he had seen it in security footage, in incident reports, in after-action analyses of scenarios far more serious than this one, was to move the child. Motion was well-intentioned and counterproductive. You moved the child to the information desk, to the security office, and by doing so, you removed the child from the location where the searching adult would naturally return. Daniel stayed where he was. He angled his position so that he could see both the fountain entrance corridor and the main cross corridor. He kept Sophie engaged with a quiet game. He held up his hand. She counted fingers. He changed the count. She corrected him. The game was boring enough to feel safe and engaging enough to keep her present. A security guard arrived at the 4-minute mark. He was young, mid-20s, and he had the posture of someone who had recently completed training and was now applying it with more confidence than experience. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back. You shouldn't be." "She came from the fountain entrance," Daniel said. His tone was level, informational. "Her guardian will come back to this location. If you move her to the security office, you'll add 15 minutes to the reunion. That's your call." The guard blinked. "How do you know?" Her right shoe. Daniel didn't elaborate. The guard looked at the shoe, then at Daniel. He was processing the conflict between his training take the found child to the designated location and the logic he'd just been presented with. 5 minutes, Daniel said. If nobody appears in 5 minutes, we move her. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, a woman came through the fountain entrance at something between a run and a controlled panic. She was wearing a staff lanyard and a gray polo, and her face was the face of someone who had spent the last 6 minutes in a specific kind of hell. Her name was Mrs. Garland. She was Sophie's nanny, had been for 2 years, and she had looked away for 30 seconds at a window display, and the world had reorganized itself around a nightmare. She saw the yellow jacket and the braids and made a sound that was not a word. Sophie held up her arms. The reunion took perhaps 4 seconds of physical contact before Mrs. Garland looked up, eyes wet, and said, "Who?" Daniel was already standing. "She's fine." She counted buttons. He turned toward Lily. His daughter was still watching, still not drawing, and there was something in her expression not quite pride, more like recognition. "That's right. That's how it's done." The crowd that had formed in the last 3 minutes murmured. Someone near the pretzel kiosk said something to the person next to them. 3 or 4 phones had come out. He had no idea if they were recording or not, and didn't particularly care. What he noticed, and what he would think about later, was the black SUV pulling to the curb at the north entrance, followed by a second one, and a third. Victoria Kane did not arrive. She deployed. That was the honest word for it. The door of the lead vehicle opened before it had fully stopped, and she moved through the mall entrance with the directed energy of someone who had never once in her adult life entered a space without knowing its exit points. She was 36, tall, in dark trousers and a cream blouse that had survived a morning of meetings without acquiring a single wrinkle. Her hair was dark, cut to the jaw. She wore no jewelry except a watch. Behind her came 2 men, not security theater, actual security professionals, with the particular way of standing that came from training rather than size. And behind them, slightly breathless, her personal assistant, a young man named Marcus, who was trying to keep up while also reading from a tablet. "Where?" Victoria said. Not a question. A prompt. The mall security supervisor, who had been briefed by radio, pointed toward the pretzel kiosk corridor. Victoria's gaze went there first, and found Sophie intact, upright, no longer crying, being held by Mrs. Garland, who was crying herself. The tension in Victoria's face shifted in a way that probably no one in the room except possibly one mechanic noticed. It didn't soften exactly, but something that had been braced behind her eyes released. She walked to Sophie, crouched, put her hands on her daughter's face, spoke quietly. The conversation lasted 30 seconds. Then she stood. Marcus was beside her instantly. The nanny, later. She looked at the security supervisor. "Who found her?" The supervisor pointed. Daniel was standing at the edge of the corridor, near a display of sunglasses, one hand in the pocket of his jeans, watching this operation with the professional attention of someone who was seeing things other people weren't seeing. Lily stood at his right side, her notebook finally open again, drawing something with a dark crayon. Victoria walked toward them with the kind of directness that did not invite misinterpretation. She looked at him for a moment, the gray Henley, the work boots, the grease stain along his jaw he still hadn't noticed, and then at his daughter, and then back at him. "You stayed with her," she said. "She was scared. You didn't move her to the security desk. She would have been harder to find there." Victoria's expression did not change, but her attention sharpened in a way Daniel recognized. It was the expression of someone recalibrating a prior assumption. "Antenji," she caught herself, a flicker of something behind her eyes, and repeated it in the way it was meant to land. "What's your name?" "Daniel." She waited for more. He didn't offer it. Sophie, still in Mrs. Garland's arms, had twisted to look at Daniel. "He made me count stars," she told her mother. Victoria looked at him with something that was not yet understanding but was on its way there. "Thank you," she said, not warmly, not coldly. "Precisely," Daniel nodded. He reached for Lily's hand. "Have a good rest of your weekend," he said, and turned toward the shoe department to finish what they'd come for. Marcus caught up with them at the escalator. He was polite about it, young, earnest, slightly out of breath in the way of someone who spent most of their day at a desk. He introduced himself, said Miss. Kane wanted to express her appreciation and extended a white envelope without specifying the amount. Daniel looked at the envelope. He looked at Marcus. "No thank you," he said. Marcus blinked. He had a specific expression that people have when a social script they'd relied on has not executed as expected. It's, "She'd really like to." I understood. "No thank you." Lily was watching her father. Marcus looked at Lily, then back at Daniel, recalibrating. "May I ask why?" "You can ask." A long pause. "Okay. Why?" Daniel took Lily's hand again and stepped onto the escalator. "Because it would change what it was," he said, as the moving stairs carried them upward, and Marcus stood at the bottom, envelope still in hand, watching them go. In the car on the way home, Lily sat in the back with her notebook on her knees, drawing. The sneakers she'd chosen were in a bag at her feet. They were purple, which she'd deliberated over for 12 minutes. "Would you have taken it?" she asked. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "No." How come? Marcus looked confused. "Because where he works, everything is in exchange. Someone does something for you. You give them something. It's how they understand value." Lily was quiet for a while. Outside, the Sunday suburbs went past strip malls, gas stations, a high school with a marching band practicing in the parking lot. Saturday music. "But you do exchanges," she said. "People give you cars. You fix them. They give you money." Right. So what was different? He thought about how to say it. He was not a man who explained himself easily, not because he lacked the words, but because he'd spent years in an environment where too many words were a form of weakness. The habit had calcified. "You fix a car because it needs fixing," he said finally. "And someone pays you because that's an agreement you made in advance." Sophie needed someone to stay with her. That wasn't an agreement. That was just what needed to happen. Lily wrote something in her notebook. He suspected, correctly, that it would appear in a drawing later. What he did not say, because he was not in the habit of narrating his own psychology, was that he had spent most of a decade being paid to do things that needed to happen, and that the exchange had not always felt clean. That there was something he valued about this life precisely because the accounting was straightforward. Car broken, man fixes it, man paid. No ambiguity about what the service was for. 2 days later, the black SUV appeared in front of Hayes' auto. Victoria Kane stood in the garage doorway in the same dark trousers, different blouse. She was alone, no Marcus, no security, which told Daniel something. He was under a truck when the shadow fell across the concrete. He rolled out. "Miss Kane," he said, not entirely surprised. She looked at the garage with the focused attention she apparently gave to everything: the workbench, the tools arranged by size and type, the hand-drawn diagram Lily had made of a carburetor and taped to the wall beside the coffee maker. "You organize your tools the way former military does," she said. "Former something," he agreed. He stood, wiped his hands on a rag, and waited. She turned to face him. "Sophie's nanny reviewed the incident with our security team. There's a 3-minute gap in the mall's camera coverage of the corridor where Sophie was separated." "I know." She paused. "How?" "I was watching them do incident response. They kept checking the footage from the wrong camera angle. The gap isn't a malfunction. Someone knew where the coverage ended." He folded the rag. "Your security team noticed, I'm guessing. That's why you're here." Victoria's expression did not change, but she took half a step forward involuntary, he thought. The physical expression of information arriving faster than expected. "We noticed this morning. We've been treating the incident as a standard lost child situation." It was a lost child situation. But it might have been meant to look like one. "Explain." He leaned against the workbench. "Sophie wasn't followed into the area. She wandered there on her own. But someone knew the coverage gap, which means someone knew Sophie's likely route through that section of the mall, which means either they knew her routine or they had inside information about where you'd be that day. The coverage gap wasn't created for Sophie. It was existing infrastructure. And whoever planned this knew to use it. That's not opportunistic. That's either a test or a precursor. Victoria looked at him for a long, measured moment. You worked in threat assessment, among other things. For people who needed things assessed, she almost smiled. It didn't fully arrive. I have a board meeting in 11 days. Before the meeting, I need to understand whether what happened at the mall was coincidental or deliberate. And if deliberate, whether it's connected to a situation inside my company. My security team is good, but whoever planned this, if it was planned, knew our protocols. That means they're either inside or were inside. Daniel looked at her. You're asking me to help. I'm asking if you will. You don't know anything about me. I know more than you think. She pulled a folded page from her jacket pocket and held it out. He didn't take it immediately. You don't have to look at it. I'm not trying to pressure you. I'm telling you I'm not walking in here blind. He took the page, unfolded it, didn't read it in front of her. I need to think about it, he said. Of course. She pulled a card from the same pocket. No name, just a number. Whatever you decide. She was almost to the street when Lily appeared from the back office, where she'd been doing math homework on the second folding chair. Are you the mom from the mall? She asked. Victoria stopped, turned, looked at Lily with an expression that was, briefly, entirely unguarded. Yes, she said. Lily considered this. Sophie counted 4 buttons, she said. She was pretty brave. She was, Victoria said. Thank you for telling me. After the black car was gone, Lily came to stand beside Daniel, looking at the empty street. You're going to help her, she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at his daughter, who was watching the street with the same calm attention she gave to everything, and decided that she was probably right. There are conditions, he said. Obviously, said Lily. He called the number that evening, after dinner, after Lily was asleep with her notebook on the pillow beside her. Victoria answered on the second ring. This was noted. 3 conditions, he said. First, I work from my space when possible. I don't have an office at your building. Second, my daughter's schedule doesn't change. School, pickups, dinners, those are fixed. Third, I see everything: camera systems, personnel files, access logs, communications. Everything. If there's something you're not ready to show me, tell me now, and we figure out if we can work around it. Brief silence. All 3 are acceptable. Who else knows about this arrangement? Marcus. My head of security, whose name is Tom Briggs. No one else. Briggs should know. I'll be reviewing his team's work. He won't like it. That's fine. He doesn't need to like it. He paused. One more thing. I'm not on your payroll. I'm not an employee, and I'm not a contractor. We're doing each other a favor. When it's done, it's done. Another silence, slightly longer. That's unusual. I know. Accepted, she said. The digital files arrived at 6 the next morning. Access logs, camera placement maps, security protocols, and a personnel list for the executive floor at Kane Holdings. Daniel made coffee, put Lily's lunch in her backpack, drove her to school, and came back to the garage to read. He was looking for a particular kind of pattern, not obvious malfeasance, but the small asymmetries that preceded it. An access badge used at an unusual time, a security protocol bypassed with authorization that was technically valid but contextually odd. Someone who knew the right processes well enough to stay inside them while bending them. Tom Briggs arrived at the garage on Tuesday afternoon with the posture of a man who had been told to cooperate and had decided to cooperate badly. He was 51, former law enforcement, 20 years in private security. He set a stack of folders on Daniel's workbench with the energy of a man dropping a challenge. Daniel moved the folders aside without opening them. Tell me about the week before the mall. Any variations in Sophie's schedule that someone with access to Kane's calendar might have known about? Briggs blinked. You're not going to... I'll read everything. Start with the week before, Briggs told him. Daniel listened without taking notes, which seemed to unsettle Briggs more than the questions. At the end, Daniel said, "Your system logs badge access by floor, but not by specific door within a floor. That's standard." It is, but it means someone could access the executive communications room on the 14th floor without it being distinguishable from any other visit to the 14th floor. Briggs was quiet. "Who on the executive team has been on the 14th floor most often in the last 2 months?" Daniel asked. "Not counting their own office visits." Briggs went pale in the specific way of someone who had just understood something they hadn't wanted to understand. The picture assembled over 8 days. Not dramatically, not with a single breakthrough, but incrementally, the way honest investigations went. One data point clarified another. A timeline emerged. A motive became visible not from anything dramatic, but from the arithmetic of what someone stood to gain. The executive in question was named Lawrence Whitfield. 54. CFO for 6 years. He had been at Kane Holdings long enough to know its protocols completely, and long enough to have cultivated the specific kind of quiet resentment that grew in people who were powerful but not powerful enough, who looked at the person above them and calculated what they were owed. His plan was not, as far as Daniel could determine, to harm Sophie. The incident at the mall was what it appeared to be. A test. Whitfield had been using a consulting group ostensibly for legitimate financial analysis that had deep connections to 2 of Kane's institutional investors. He needed to know how Kane Holdings responded to a crisis involving Victoria personally, because he was planning to engineer a larger one that would compromise her standing with the board before a significant vote on a company restructuring that would, if it went a certain way, allow Whitfield to consolidate financial authority at the expense of the CEO's office. The mall incident was reconnaissance. The 3-minute camera gap had been known to Whitfield because he had coordinated with the mall's security infrastructure vendor, who had done work for Kane Holdings 2 years earlier, and retained contact with Whitfield through a shell arrangement that was nearly invisible in the financial records. Nearly. Daniel laid it out for Victoria on a Tuesday evening at the garage, with Lily doing homework in the back office. He used a legal pad, a timeline drawn in pencil, and 3 printed documents, the access logs, the consultant billing records, and a single email chain obtained through entirely legitimate discovery that Whitfield had apparently believed was adequately buried. Victoria sat on a stool at the workbench and read everything twice. She did not react dramatically. This was one of the things about her that Daniel had, over 10 days, come to understand. She processed at high speed and low volume. Her reactions lived in the small adjustments, the way she placed a page face down when she'd finished with it, the stillness that preceded a decision. "The board meeting is in 3 days, she said. "I know. Whitfield doesn't know he's been found." "No." She looked at the timeline. "The consulting group. Has anyone outside this room seen this?" "No. I want to keep it that way until the meeting." She looked at him. "I want to end it in the room." Daniel considered this. That's a choice that leaves him room to maneuver beforehand. "I know, but it's the choice that closes the door completely. If I act now, outside the meeting, his lawyers file injunctions, his allies at the institutional investors claim I acted without board authority. And the narrative becomes mine versus his, without a resolution." She turned the timeline page over. "In the room, with the board present, there is no injunction. There is only what's true." He looked at her for a moment. "You've done this before. Not exactly this, but something like it." A brief pause. "What do you need from me for the meeting?" "A chair," he said, "and permission to say one thing if it becomes necessary." She almost smiled again. This time it completed. The Kane Holdings boardroom occupied a corner of the 22nd floor with 2 walls of windows that showed the city in every direction. There were 12 people in the room when Daniel arrived, which meant there were 12 people who registered his presence with the particular attention people gave to someone who didn't fit their expectation of who should be there. He wore a white Oxford shirt and dark trousers, which was the closest he'd come to dressing for anything in 3 years. He sat against the wall, not at the table, with a legal pad and a pen. He did not have a laptop. He did not have a presentation. Victoria opened the meeting with the efficiency of someone who had run many meetings and had no patience for procedural theater. She covered 3 agenda items at normal pace. Whitfield, seated at her left, contributed at normal intervals. He was good at this, that was part of why it had taken this long. The 4th agenda item was the restructuring proposal. Whitfield had barely finished presenting his framing, the careful language about operational efficiency and board authority, when Victoria said, "Before we discuss the proposal, I want to address something that's come to my attention regarding the basis of the recommendation." The room shifted. She looked at Tom Briggs, who was standing at the door. He placed a folder in front of each board member. Daniel watched Whitfield's face, the face of a man reading something he expected to read, and reading something he didn't. The folder contained the timeline, the access logs, the consulting arrangement, the email chain. Whitfield looked up. His eyes found Daniel, who was still sitting against the wall with his legal pad, and he put together the source in the way of a man who had made a precise calculation that had not accounted for a variable. "These materials were compiled by an independent analyst at my request," Victoria said. "Over the last 10 days, they demonstrate that the restructuring proposal before this board was constructed in coordination with outside parties who have a financial interest in weakening the CEO's office ahead of this vote. I'd like to ask Lawrence to respond." The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when everyone in them is calculating. Whitfield responded. He used the word context 7 times in 4 minutes. He used the word mischaracterization 5 times. He was articulate and organized and completely unable to address the specific documents in front of him, because the specific documents in front of him were accurate. At the moment when Whitfield's response began to circle back on itself, the 4th time he'd referred to the nature of the consulting relationship, Daniel spoke for the first and only time. The consulting agreement was invoiced through a subsidiary registered in Delaware in March of last year. The registration date is 6 weeks after the CEO's office declined Whitfield's request for expanded CFO authority. The timeline isn't coincidental. He paused. "That's the only point I wanted to make." 2 seconds of silence. Victoria said, "Thank you." She looked at Whitfield. "Lawrence, we'll handle the formal process outside this room. I'd ask you to wait with Tom." Whitfield stood. He straightened his jacket. He was a man who had been prepared for many eventualities and had not been prepared for this one, and the gap between his preparation and his reality was visible in the way he walked to the door, too controlled, overcorrected, the walk of someone holding something in. The door closed behind him. Victoria looked at the board. "The restructuring proposal is withdrawn. We'll schedule a proper governance review for the proposal's underlying concerns, using an external facilitator. Is there any objection?" There was not. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. Daniel was in the elevator when Victoria fell in beside him. "One thing," she said. "Yes, the Delaware registration date. How did you find that?" "It was in the corporate filings. Public record." She looked at him. "My team went through the corporate filings. They were looking for the consulting relationship. I was looking for what happened 6 weeks before it." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. "You looked for the origin, not the act," she said. "That's usually where the truth is." 3 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon that had the particular quality of late autumn Saturdays, cool, unhurried, the light coming in at a low angle that made everything look more significant than it was, Lily Hayes and Sophie Kane were in the side yard of the garage, engaged in a project that had begun as a birdhouse and was evolving into something considerably more ambitious and structurally uncertain. Sophie had come with Mrs. Garland and no security detail, which had required a conversation between Victoria and her head of security that Daniel had not been party to, but could infer the shape of. Lily had greeted Sophie the same way she greeted everyone, directly, without ceremony, and had immediately put her to work. Daniel was in the garage, working on a '94 Bronco, whose owner had described its ailment as "it makes a sound." He was listening to the Bronco and listening to the girls and drinking coffee that had gone cold 40 minutes ago, and not particularly minding either. He heard the crunch of tires on the gravel. Victoria came in through the open roll-up door the way she'd come in the first time, alone, direct, taking in the space without comment. She was in jeans and a dark jacket, which was the most informal he'd seen her. She looked like herself, which he suspected took effort. "How are things at the company?" he asked. "Manageable." She watched him work for a moment. The board approved an external governance review. Whitfield's lawyers filed 2 motions that will go nowhere. The institutional investors who were in his orbit are taking a careful distance. She paused. "It will be a difficult 6 months. But they'll be honest ones. That's not nothing, no." She looked around the garage, the tools, the diagrams, Lily's carburetor drawing still taped to the wall. "I want to offer you a consulting arrangement. Formal. Well compensated. Not permanent, if you don't want permanent. But available when things come up." He didn't answer immediately. He was listening to something in the Bronco's engine, a hesitation that wasn't quite where he'd expected it. "What does that mean for how I work?" he asked. "It means what you said it would mean. Your space. Your schedule. Your conditions. I'd have access to you when I need a perspective I'm not getting from people who have reasons to tell me what I want to hear." He set down the ratchet. "Why me specifically? Because you found the Delaware registration date. Because you stayed with a crying child when it was simpler not to. Because you said no to the envelope without making it a statement about yourself." She looked at him. "People who don't need things from you are rare. It changes what they're able to see." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the girls had resolved some structural dispute and were hammering something with unified energy. "I'll think about it," he said. "I know." She moved toward the door, then stopped. "Sophie talks about the button counting. I wanted you to know. She tells the story accurately. She says, you made it a game so she wouldn't be scared. She did the counting. I just asked the question." Victoria stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the side yard where her daughter was hammering an impractical birdhouse with a girl she'd known for 3 weeks, and there was something in her expression that was not quite the expression she wore in boardrooms or in black SUVs or in the corridors of the 22nd floor. Something that lived below all of that, in the part of a person that existed before they became the version of themselves they showed the world. "You always seem to know where to stand," she said. It was quiet, not performative. The sentence of someone making an observation rather than a declaration, even when no one's watching. Daniel looked at her. "Especially then," he said. She almost said something else. Then she stepped out into the afternoon light, and he turned back to the Bronco. From the side yard came the sound of a hammer, and then a crack that was probably not structural, and then 2 children laughing at whatever had just gone wrong. Daniel picked up his ratchet. The Bronco made its sound. He listened.